Welcome, Annika.
Thank you. Thank you very
back.
much. So I'm going to present a study, and as you already heard, it's a study between Sweden and Finland, so it's a comparative study of these countries. And actually, Eva is probably the only one who has been collecting data here today now. She's been part of this project, right? And Peter, he's home with a sick child, he's the one who's done a lot of analysis on this data, and I was sort of coming from the side and jumping in and looking at this and finding it very interesting, so I was curious to see a comparative side. The focus is on design for teacher-student relations, how teachers design their teaching practices, and in relation to their beliefs about student autonomy in a one-to-one classroom setting where they use tablets. The arguments for doing this analysis was basically because, you know, there's such an emphasis on the lifelong learning and digital competencies and what do students need in order to have these. And I come from the side of self-regulated learning research. That was my interest. And autonomy was also something that Peter was looking very much into power relations and stuff like that. So that's sort of where we met in the middle. Another argument is that, you know, teachers' beliefs and attitudes about educational philosophies influence how they design their teaching practices, and this is important to understand in order to improve the educational process in itself. So this is sort of the argument for looking at these. And the research questions were, how do teachers in Finland and Sweden differ in their beliefs about student autonomy and self-regulation in relation to how they design for power and control in a one-to-one computing classroom? So that's the essence. So it's more or less the beliefs affect the choices they do for teaching practices, and that's also affects then how they implement the one-to-one computing in the classroom. Research on teachers' pedagogical beliefs has previously been separated into this dichotomy of teacher-centered beliefs contrasted to student-centered beliefs, and the teacher-centered beliefs then are associated with behavioristic teaching practices, emphasis on discipline and subject matter moral standards. Teacher is the authority supervising the learning acquisition, and the teacher is the expert, and it's a more highly structured learning environment. While the student-centered beliefs then is more towards the constructivistic and social constructivistic teaching practices, emphasizing on individual student needs and interests and students' active participation on multiple levels in different problem-solving opportunities. But it's not as simple as this, because research already from the 50s, I think, showed that teachers can actually hold both of these beliefs at the same time. So we have to look at the beliefs from a multidimensional perspective instead of looking at it as a dichotomy of two different groups. Then Peter gave me this article that was really intrigued me in many ways. It was by this Uwe Skarpenes, and he was talking about individualization versus socialization, and I thought this is about the argument, why should we design for student autonomy in the first place, and why is it important to balance these in the pedagogical context in order then to avoid alienation, instead empower the student to become autonomous but not individualized in a way that becomes, you know, alienated from being socially inclusive and collaborative, you know, skill-based and stuff like that. So I found that very interesting. I also found this really old book by Carl Rogers about freedom to learn. He has this anecdote in the beginning where he has this teacher, describes this teacher who lets her class, and she has a very difficult classroom and she lets them loose to become autonomous. They have structures about how they do their tasks and stuff like that, but she sort of explores what happens when she gives them autonomy to work on their task by their own and so forth. And she realized that, of course, it's not working with everybody. There are this group of students that thrive when they get autonomy, but then there's these students that are very insecure and they need the scaffold to become autonomous in that context. And then there's the third group of students which need authority to give discipline and guidelines. And this is what I think it's interesting from a student needs perspective to see how can we design for self-regulation when we have these diverse needs from the student's perspective also. So that's another argument. And when we talk about teachers' digital competence, it was very interesting. Like I said earlier, I'm very interested in what I call digital relational competence, and we had Rune Krumsvik was here talking about digital competence, and I asked him, well, what about digital relational competence? Have you looked at that? And he said, no, but that's probably very important, he said. And then the next time I met him, he said, yeah, well, now we have looked at it, and we found that the strongest predictor for digital competence was actually teacher-student relations. So that's another argument why we should look more into this for digital relational competence also. And when I looked at this relational competence within a normal context, they talk about defining it as the teacher's ability to be both sensitive and responsive to student needs in the moment. When I've looked at it from in a distance context, distance learning context, it also becomes very important to be anticipative of students' digital needs so that you can plan for needs in advance before you actually go into class. Part of this, I also include the power distance in the teacher-student communication in the classroom, which Peter has looked at when he looked at the observations in this study. That's also then how that is operationalized in his analysis, which I will tell you more about. So it's all about the power distance here, the degree of equality between individuals, where the teacher is either then authority versus supporting autonomy and influence. Interestingly enough, my research says that there's a difference between Finland and Sweden when we look at power distance in how teachers teach in their classroom, how they design for power relations in their classroom. And Peter has used Bernstein for looking at these power relations in the observational data, and the operationalization of this category is on these three levels, where the teacher is either doing a regular lecture in a traditional sense, talking like I am now, or there are some interactions, or there are more interactions, or there is a permanent interaction between the student and the teacher, and which I find very interesting, the last one, as an example, the teacher exposes his or her own lack of knowledge. So it's sort of stepping down and becoming equal, and we're solving problems here together, and we're both on the level of not knowing. So these are the four that he has been looking at. And the Bernstein terminology, so they talk about teacher power and student power. Of course, then the teacher power is where the teacher doesn't involve students in decision making, or only to a limited extent. While the student power then is where the students get a greater extent of evolving in the decision making on how the learning happens. And here are examples of a teacher power where students sit in rows and get this lecture. And Bernstein says that principle keeping things apart, while the student power is more where the students then have more power control. They sit in group work, and the principle then of keeping things together. They can do the collaborative working and being independent in that sense. Here's another example where they can choose where and how to study. So the data from this huge study then that's been carried out here in Umeå University has included Denmark, Sweden and Finland, and the data that I've been looking at together with Peter then is he has looked at the classroom observations and done the Bernstein analysis on those, and I've looked at teacher interviews and sort of integrated the analysis And the phases of analysis then is the classroom observations that he did. He coded according to Bernstein's theory of power control. And then I did a cluster analysis and quantified the codings for this separate category of teacher-student communication. And I looked at the interviews and did content analysis, categorization of teachers' beliefs. And at first I looked very broadly on learning and attitudes towards changes with iPads and tablets in the classroom. But then these two crystallized as very interesting in relation to what he had been observing. So we focused on the autonomy and self-regulation. Integrated analysis, then I did a crosstab query using NVivo to look at how the teacher beliefs related to the clusters that we got from the cluster analysis and how that compared with a comparative analysis between the countries then. And here are what Peter had looked at from on a broad scale from all the categories of Bernstein. This is the one that I picked out the data from to look at only then the teacher-student communication and the hierarchical patterns there and what he had found. And he made, this is what Peter made then from the Finnish teachers, which we presented at ESL last year. And then we got a lot of comments about that. Well, perhaps there is like, because we had these student power and teacher power clusters, we got a lot of discussion about, well, maybe there's like a third option there that where the teachers are not only student power or not only teacher power, but actually kind of finding a middle ground where they can move in between these sort of power clusters. Because he had drawn these arrows there to sort of, but they're moving this way, you know. So that's what I tried to do then with the cluster analysis. So I converted these numbers of his observational codings into like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different categories and got clusters, which then, and I had like a forced 3 cluster sample on that. So it actually became these 3 categories. And the interesting thing is that the Finnish teachers were the only ones in the teacher control cluster. And the biggest group was the mixed control. And then we had 5 teachers from Sweden in the student control. So that actually sort of confirms the earlier research also that the Finnish teachers are actually more authoritative and have more teacher control. That was an interesting find. Then from the content analysis, there was beliefs about autonomy, which could be then categorized in negative and positive, the beliefs about it, but then also the concerns about it. You can see that the number of teacher control was 3, the mixed control in Finland was 11, and student control in Sweden were 5, and mixed control in Sweden were 3. So the number of negative teachers, only 1 talked about the negative in the teacher control, and the mixed control 4 of them. And you can see here in the condensed meaning from these statements, like new terminology and teaching styles were discussed as 1. Student lack of skills were another. Habits of being served, so they can't be autonomous, they're just used to being served and can't take the responsibility themselves. Or it's actually age inappropriate responsibility, that's what they thought. While the positive, then you can see that the student control from Sweden, that's where the most of them, they're the most positive about the autonomy. Like for instance, yeah, all of them talked about the positive aspects of being autonomous, while none of the teacher control cluster talked about positive stuff. So that's interesting also. For instance, self-motivation to get inspired, learn to think independently, or learn to take responsibility. So that they actually see it as it's not like it's age inappropriate, but it's actually a possibility to learn to take responsibility. So it's sort of flipping the attitude. They learn how to self-reflect and self-regulate, and they have the possibility to influence and affordance to choose how to learn, and they develop deeper understanding. And from this, I looked at also how teachers talked about emphasizing how to scaffold self-regulation and autonomy. These are then the condensed meaning, for instance, provide time plan and follow-up. You can see here at this one, feedback, feed forward, and dialogue about quality of learning. That's probably the most where most people talked about. So I would say John Hattie has come through with his research in both countries. It's kind of interesting also that the student control in Sweden, they talked about be a digital police. So although they find that, you know, we give a lot of control, but we also have to be a digital police to them. You can also see that the student control, the Swedish teachers, they talked most about self-regulation, how to work around that, and how to support and scaffold. The thing is that I think it's like a methodological consideration in these studies that the interviews in Finland were usually done in English, and the ones in Sweden were of course done in Swedish, and you can hear how the difference in how fluently they were talking about their work experience and how they had the terminology to sort of discuss also these issues. So I think that might also be one of the influencing factors which can affect the results in a study like this. But I found it very interesting to do this comparison. And how to summarize this, I don't know. Do you have any questions? How should we continue? Is this worthwhile exploring more to see is there a difference? Yeah.
Could you explain that last point you made about them having the vocabulary to?
Oh, the teachers, the interviews that I looked at, the teachers, because the data was collected. First they observed the classroom, and then they interviewed the teachers afterwards about their teaching practices. So, yeah.
Was there a difference between the two countries, or wasn't there?
Yeah, because of the language. They were interviewed in another language that, you know, than their own mother tongue.
Oh.
So the Swedes could speak their own language, while the Finnish teacher talked in English.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah.
Thank you. It was very interesting, and I feel that what we have this category of freedom of choice had quite a lot to do with this. The teachers who think that they have the throats all the time in their own hands, and they cannot like give any freedom to students. But I also understand teachers' problem. I was interviewing one of the teachers about guiding groups, which are then separated in different groups, and she said that I don't know how to guide groups, and I have just thought that I don't go and disturb them because I don't know what to do. And I liked her answer because she was very honest. In teacher training, she doesn't get such kind of skills how to support these who want to do differently. She knows how to present something, but she doesn't have such kind of skills of guiding. And I think that is one of the essential problems that students, some teachers feel that they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So it's better that I don't let them do much themselves.
Yeah, so it's basically this one, be a guide on the side that you're talking about, in a way that, you know, you can let them do it and be autonomous, but support them from the side.
Yeah, but even that, not even on the side, but in the other rooms, so that I don't disturb them because I don't know what to do.
Yeah, yeah. So she's stepping out, not
Exactly.
being the guide on the side. Yeah.
Does this autonomy come how close to the concept of agency?
Agency. I would think that's very much emancipation. You know, be empowered to you know, have the skills to deal with the tasks at hand. Yeah.
We have some work on that, but we can maybe discuss it later. But my actual question was that have you considered broadening this research into that we assume to be very different cultural context, such as Asian countries, or so from the perspective of autonomy or agency,
Yeah.
it would be
To
very
compare with the Nordic
compare
countries.
with
Yeah.
So we quite often think that Nordic countries are the same, and
Yeah.
because we have one plan now, and there we have China and US and some Southern European and Northern countries.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Do they have like a curriculum in the same sense that we have here in the Nordic countries also? Talking
in
about
we are doing our work at the university context there,
Okay.
so it's slightly different context. But
because we had at a seminar here, we were discussing the arguments for doing this sort of comparison, and I actually went into the curriculums and compared, and I put the text, the Finnish text and the Swedish text in Vivo to look at the wordings and do they use the same word, and it was very interesting because it was such a big difference in how the terminology was used in the two different countries. I mean, we think they're quite the same, but they weren't in terms of the terminology being used in the curriculum. Yeah.
I would like to ask you that do you feel that the kind of absolute freedom is the best solution then? Do you have such a kind of norm in your mind?
No,
What is your idea?
I think that Carl Rogers was onto something when he said that, you know, there are different needs and we have to, as a teacher, be able to see those needs and adapt to them. So being responsive and sensitive to, but also anticipative to the needs of the students. So as a teacher, to be very flexible in order to maybe enhance their agency to become autonomous. But yeah, from the Skarpenist perspective, then, you know, do we want we would want a culture that is totally aimed towards autonomy and independence and individualization, or do we want to enhance the collaborative socialization and you know, inclusiveness of society? I mean, that's in what ways do we do it, and how do we then give the tools to teachers to actually identify what is the autonomy we want to support?
I was very happy you asked that question because one of the articles which is getting out these days that I've written is about involvement, that kind of thing. And what I found, and I was wondering if you found the same, was that students don't really want to actively decide what to do and how to do it. They want, because that also of course means that they're responsible for the outcome of the process, right? But that they actually want the teachers to adapt to what they are doing, their answers and things like that, so that they are more like a guide on their side and contribute with their procedural and content knowledge in collaboration, rather than saying, do you want to work like this or work like that? How do you want to work? What do you want to work with? I don't know if you, because you asked about complete autonomy, which I found that they really, really care because they want the teachers' competences in the process. Did you find anything?
But you should ask Peter that question, or maybe Eva can answer, because she was there at the because that would be from the observational data that you could see, you know, how do they respond to the sort of power relations that they're designing, you know, the teachers are using here. So, do you want to?
If the students want to be responsible for their learning or not.
Yeah, if they want to be the ones who decide how to work, or to work with things like that.
Maybe not in that study, but in another teaching in teacher education. When I tried in a group myself, really let them be responsible, and they refused. No, please tell us what to do. We don't want to decide. So, and in the Swedish study, during the observations, the students are quite, steered or geared towards what to do.
Yeah.
They don't have some of the teachers, if they have a an assignment, they will presenting from a movie or something. They are not allowed to choose on the topic, they choose content. But in Bernstein, for example, we analyzed through 13 categories for the power and control. One of them is if the students are allowed to choose content. And then in fact they are not so often allowed to choose content, and at least not in the Swedish study. But sometimes when they use technology, if they are going to present something, PowerPoint or making a video or something, they are often just left alone. They are not, the teachers or someone else is not teaching them how to use PowerPoint or how to use making videos and so on, but then they are left to choose how to present, but not the content, for example. So they are quite steered anyway on how to do things, unless they are using the technology for producing presentations in different ways. But the students, and I also guess depending on the age, they are not so used to it. So I'm not quite sure if they can also respond to if they want to or not, because they're not so used to it, to take responsibility.
Because that was my concern as well, that that we wanted more autonomous students who are able to direct their own learning and so on. But they keep asking us, and whether that was a sign that we kind of fail as teachers, or that they were using us like they would use any other resource as a sort of a source of information, any content or procedural things. And I'm not sure if I had the answer, or that's why that was why I was asking if you had noticed anything like they would be using the teachers as a resource rather than.
No, I didn't look at the observation, only the teacher interviews. That's what I did. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think it's maybe it's not a question, maybe it's a commentary, because I think autonomy, student autonomy, is an ethical concept, at least to me. And you said in the first slide that you have to balance not to be alienated to yourself or to society, either of the two extremes, but you should be put somewhere in between, so that the whole idea of student autonomy is actually to become self-dependent without becoming self-sufficient. So the responsibility of the teacher, in order to teach towards student autonomy, must be to set up environments or design spaces where this ethical dimension of also what you said, the student should be as well responsible, responsive to each other and sensitive towards each other, and even planning for their own future. So I think you already gave the answer. What you expect from the teacher in the values and attitudes are what we as responsible teachers must do in order to have student autonomy, to design for it. So you must always ask yourself, the way that I provide any didactic setup, does that actually improve sensitivity, responsiveness, or does that do the opposite? I think you need to ask each other that kind of questions.
Problematize and reflect on. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think he was first. Yeah.
I'm reflecting on what you are saying about digital competence, and especially that digital competence is related to teacher-student relationship. So I may conclude that digital competence is very much involved by relational competences. So to understand, in both Finland and Sweden, if I use my own perspectives today, I think that they have their own conceptions of digital competence, but these perspectives is different because of the social practices, different social practices. So digital competence is not a general or common concept is culturally dependent. So, only a reflection after my own speech or thinking today. So it's interesting to see that you are.
So should we have to look at digital competence in as cultural dependent and see what differs between these ideas about what it actually is? Is that what you're?
That may be one approach to just to dig out more of it. It's interesting to see. One thing that is dependent on the relations, but what does it really mean in different cultures?
Yeah.
So
I know the Rune's research, they had operationalized the student-teacher relations from a questionnaire where teachers had sort of rated the teacher-student relations. So that was different to of course the Bernstein perspective of the power relations. So it was looking at the same thing but from different kind of operational perspective in that sense. So interesting ideas.
triggering
Yeah.
more interesting questions.
Anybody else? Oh. Everybody's hungry.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.